Hello everyone and welcome to another video. In this video, I'm going to be showing you exactly how to publish your Kafka API in Gravitee to your developer portal. Now the developer portal is mainly going to be used as your interface for publishing and exposing APIs for internal and external access. What good is an API if you can't give the right people access to that API? To find out information about the API, like look at documentation, for example, for a Kafka-based API, you might want to view the async spec, and view in how to interact with that API and what kind of information to expect. So of course, we're going to be using Gravitee as our API gateway to do and handle all of this for us. Now, what I'm going to be doing for you today is I'm actually standing up a local Kafka server that I'm going to be using in order to assist with this demonstration. So you might have your own flavor of Kafka, and that's perfectly fine. We actually don't limit you to what type of distributor of Kafka or what type of engine your Kafka server is running on. In my case, I'm using a local Docker Compose, and this is simply going to stand up my Kafka server, and it's also going to allow me to specify what kind of DNSs I'm going to be using to access my Kafka here. And then of course, we're also using the same Docker Compose to stand up our APIM components. So with all that being said, and assuming that you've got the right pieces here, like your license in order to use the Kafka gateway, as well as your consumer configuration or properties that are going to connect to the gateway, and we can actually go ahead and get started. And I will actually mention that this README is super succinct. It includes everything from standing up your Docker Compose with very, very explicit instructions all the way to following along with exactly what I'm doing here in this video. Now, without further ado, let's go ahead and show you what it looks like to actually hit kind of an open Kafka API in Gravitee. And this is one that we have not added any type of protection to. So before we publish this API to our developer portal, let's go ahead and make sure that it works. So very simply, I'm going to make sure that this API is started. Now I can open up my terminal, and what I can do is I actually have a library that I'm currently using that's going to allow me to stand up a Kafka client that's going to connect to our gateway through its Bootstrap server. So I'm referencing the name of my API, which is foo here, and I can actually make this a little bit bigger. And so this API's name is foo, and my Bootstrap server is kafka.local at port 9092. And all I'm doing is I'm specifying specifically here in my Kafka client that I'm producing data to a topic called external-data on my Kafka server, and I'm using these properties here. Now we'll look at this in a second. I'm actually going to change this in order to reference an open keyless plan. And whoops, looks like I got plan there twice. And the reason for that is because I have two different property files. And the first one that we're going to be testing, just to make sure that this API works, is an open keyless plan. As you can see in Gravitee, I have no authentication on this API. When we go and publish this onto the portal, we'll definitely add that authentication. So let's go ahead and make sure that this works here. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and fire off this command, and this is going to successfully enable us to now start to make messages to this topic called external-data. So what I'll do to test this out is I'll make a quick message. We'll say Faraz, and we'll say Faraz123. Now I'll close this connection, and I'll open up my Kafka client, my UI here. We'll see our topic that is I believe we push to external-data. I'll open up my messages. We see Faraz, and then Faraz123. Perfect. Now, we want to add authentication on this API, and we also want to push it to the developer portal. We want to actually subscribe to it and see how Gravitee is facilitating that subscription process. Very, very, very simple. So what we'll do is we'll close this keyless plan. And the reason for that, quite obviously, is you can't have an authentication plan and a keyless plan. That's kind of redundant. So we'll add a new plan here. We'll make an API key plan. and we'll call this the Platinum API key policy, or Platinum, let's just say key policy, make it very simple. Now we can choose in Gravitee, super cool here, to either have Gravitee force us to manually approve these subscription requests before a user can get all that bootstrap server and the authentication credentials, your Jazz config, or we can check this off and have that auto-validated. Whenever someone makes a subscription request, it's going to immediately be available to that consumer. So perfect. We'll go ahead and click next here, and we'll create this authentication. Now we'll go ahead and actually publish this plan to make sure it's live. And now we'll go ahead and deploy this API. Now what I want to do is I actually want to go ahead and test this and make sure that for any fault of my own, no one is able to access this using the keyless plan properties. They can't just go ahead and configure a connection or establish a connection with our Bootstrap server listening on the Kafka gateway without actually subscribing to a plan. So again, same thing here. We'll do for us, and you can see immediately I'm getting that error back, and it's telling me that we're having a networking error. In other words, there is an authentication error. So perfect. That's exactly what we want to see. Now what we'll do is we'll go ahead and go to our configuration, and we'll publish this API. So now what we've done, very simply, in one simple click, is if we go to our developer portal, and this is running on localhost 8085, in your case, you might have a cloud-hosted portal, which is perfectly fine. We see our API called for us. Here it is here. This is our Kafka API. I'll refresh this and then click on Learn More to actually dive a little bit deeper into this API. Now you can see that we're not getting much information on this API. So what I want to do now is I'm going to go to Documentation. I'm going to go to Documentation Pages, and I'm going to add my async specification here. And you can see I've already done this, which is perfect. More than likely, if you have any streaming-based APIs, you're most certainly going to be writing your async spec. This is your OAS version of the streaming world's APIs. And this is going to give your developers a lot of information to work with, right? Now, on the other hand, I also want to give some information, such as Markdown, to my consumers that are visiting this page and looking at the details section, the very first thing that they're going to see. So what I'll do is I'll fill in the content myself, but you can absolutely go ahead and import your OAS, or sorry, your Markdown. You can also link it to an external source. So if you've got some sort of versioning system where you're doing content CI/CD on your Markdown files, they're hosted in some Git repository, you can go ahead and link that. You can integrate with any of these different integrations here and have us constantly pull the most up-to-date version of your documentation directly into Gravitee here. Now, for the sake of the demo, I'll go ahead and add a very weak Markdown here, but this is my Kafka API, and I'll say, please treat it kindly. For instructions, it's actually quite simple. Go ahead and click on subscribe. And the reason I'm making this super simple is because my Markdown is not the best. So I'm going to go ahead and click on save and publish. And you can see that this page is now published. So if I was to go back into my catalog and reopen this API, immediately my Markdown is available to me. Now, the very cool thing as well is that because I've uploaded my AsyncAPI spec in here, I can view that directly in this API, and I can actually interact with all different facets of this Kafka API. I can check what type of parameters are accepted. I can go ahead and see what kind of payloads to expect, what kind of headers that are generated here, and so on and so forth. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and make a subscription to this Kafka API. It's super simple. All we're going to do is click on subscribe. Now, depending on the authentication methods that you've defined here, we might have 3 different authentication plans. And we've seen in other videos, I'll link them in the description below, that you can certainly use policies in your API plan for my flow. You can use policies in your flows here, and these policies can be Kafka specific. You can actually limit what type of access a user has on different topics, for example. And you can also do really, really cool things with quotas. You can do things with rate limits. And of course, who does not love topic mapping? This is going to be extremely relevant to making sure you lock down your Kafka cluster and keep everything at the gateway level in terms of routing. So let's assume that we have the one plan for now, but you can certainly create multiple different plans, and they're going to show up here depending on the different granularity and access that you're providing to your consumers. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and click on Next here. And we're simply going to be using an application that's considered something like a developer's project that's actually going to facilitate this subscription to our Kafka API. So once you've created your application, you can go ahead and select it and click on Next. And in the case that you need to provide a comment, let's say for that manual subscription approval flow that we were talking about earlier, you can go ahead and include that here. Because we've already selected that automated enable auto approval on subscriptions, we don't necessarily have to include this. We can assume that anyone that creates an application and subsequently a subscription is given access to that API. So let's go ahead and click on subscribe. And here is where the magic happens. Is in every case, whenever a Kafka client is connecting to a Kafka server, there must be some properties that the client is using in order to call that API on that server. And so this is typically included in the form of a Jazz config. You're specifying things like your SASL mechanism, and of course, your security protocol. And so Gravitee, in knowing my Kafka API, is actually going to include all of this information for me in terms of how I'm calling my API. So what I can do is I can refer back to my properties file here. You remember that we were using the keyless properties. Again, this is all on the client side in terms of your client's infrastructure. It totally depends on how you as a client are connecting to your APIs. In my case, I'm doing everything by referencing my properties files. And so rather than convert things like my username and my key and getting the MD5 hash version of my password, instead I'm just going to copy exactly what Gravitee is giving me. And so Gravitee again is going to make sure that I include all the right information here in order to access this Kafka API. And that's it. That's all I'm including here. Now what I do is, based off of this information that I'm getting here, I've got my Jazz config, I've got my SASL mechanism, I've got my security protocol, and of course, I'm just simply referencing the right trust stores here. So as long as all that information is included, we're actually good to go ahead and start to proxy our new API. So we'll close this. We don't need that terminal open. What we'll do is we'll grab that command that we use to produce data. And for our producer connection, you remember that we're referencing the old keyless plan properties file for a client. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to reference the new one that we just created. It's called API-key-plan. So what we'll do is we'll reference that file. It's Kafka-API-key-plan-SSL.properties. And the only thing that I have to do, again, this is just part of the demo here, is I do have to make sure that my environment is running this up-to-date change. So very simply, all I'm going to do is just docker compose up-d. We'll go ahead and rerun everything to make sure that these changes that I made to our properties file are up to date. So now that that's done, we can actually go ahead and now I'm actually just going to change this slightly so that we know the topic that we're pushing to. Let's say this is our API key topic. And we'll go ahead and establish that connection. And now what we'll do is we'll go ahead and make some messages. So we'll say this is for us using the Kafka API through Gravitee. And we'll say, and it's giving us a warning that that topic didn't actually exist before. Totally fine. And we'll say another thing. We'll say Gravitee is doing all this for us. Super cool. Now, let's go back to our Kafka UI and let's make sure the topic is created. Perfect. And super cool, the messages are propagated to our Kafka server. All of that was done by proxy of us creating that API in Gravitee and then allowing our subscribers or users or consumers, internal or external, to subscribe to this Kafka API in the developer portal. And Gravitee is going to give me all of the information that I need to stand up a local Kafka client and actually start to work and interact with this API. Now, my challenge to you is to use this process of subscribing to an API and take concepts from another video in the description of adding a policy onto that API where once you pass in your API key properties, so your Jazz config and all that other jazz, let's make sure that we can do something like a topic mapping policy that we've done in another video. Again, all of that's going to be in the description. Thank you so much for watching and happy API building.